The United States military has launched another strike on what it has labeled a suspected drug trafficking vessel, this time in the Eastern Pacific. According to early reports, 4 people were killed in this most recent operation. With this incident, the ongoing military campaign ordered by the Trump administration has now resulted in the destruction of more than 20 boats and the deaths of over 80 individuals. Despite the government continuing to frame these actions as counter-narcotics missions, scrutiny is intensifying, particularly around the very first strike that occurred on September 2nd, the now infamous double-tap incident. That first operation has become the center of a rapidly evolving political and legal storm. Key questions that historically have ended presidencies, are now being raised in Congress, the intelligence community, and among military legal experts. Among those concerns is whether senior officials knowingly ordered a second strike on survivors. According to leaks and congressional briefings, the order allegedly used the phrase, "kill them all." While new detail continued to emerge, some facts are already clear. There was a leak. Someone inside the Department of Defense provided information to the press about the existence of a second strike in the September 2nd incident. We know a video of the second strike exists. We know that members of Congress, including top-ranking officials on the House Intelligence Committee, have personally viewed it, and what they saw appears to have deeply disturbed them. Following a closed-door briefing, Congressman Jim Himes, ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, spoke briefly to the press. His statement was astonishing in its severity. "What I saw in that room is one of the most troubling scenes I have ever witnessed in my time in public service." He was referring to the unedited footage of the second strike. But what exactly is in that footage? Who gave the order? Which commanders participated? Was the Secretary of Defense involved? Was the President aware? These questions remain unanswered, in part because the Department of Defense has dramatically restricted press access and limited who receives briefings. The Pentagon recently changed its long-standing media rules, requiring reporters to agree not to publish unauthorized information if they want access to the briefing room. This represents a significant departure from decades of transparency practices. Ironically, despite these efforts to limit leaks, the most damaging information, the existence of the second strike, was still leaked. The story is growing, not shrinking, and with each new detail, concern deepens. The September 2nd operation is no longer seen as an isolated incident, but as a first in a chain of controversial missions, each raising questions about legality, oversight, and truthfulness. With public trust shaken, congressional leaders are demanding answers. But so far, answers have not been freely given. Instead, there is a widening gap between what the administration claims and what leaked information reveals. It is in that gap that political danger grows, not just for individuals involved but for the presidency itself. While the public continues searching for answers, one of the most baffling aspects of this story is how selectively the Department of Defense has handled congressional briefings. Several lawmakers who have expressed skepticism about the legality of these maritime strikes say they were never given access to even basic intelligence summaries. Others, mainly those already supportive of the administration, appear to have been briefed repeatedly. One of the loudest voices raising concerns has been a member of Congress who openly stated, "I have been offered no briefings, and I believe that is intentional." His skepticism, combined with his insistence on oversight, seems to have placed him outside the circle of those receiving information. This selective transparency is causing frustration not only among critics but also within portions of the national security community. The timing of Admiral Alvin Hosley's resignation further complicates the picture. Admiral Hosley publicly announced his resignation on October 16th, the same day 2 survivors were reportedly pulled from the water following another maritime strike, this one also raising questions of excessive force. Whether the Admiral's departure was connected to these events is unknown, but the coincidence is difficult to ignore. In an environment where information is already tightly controlled, unexplained departures from senior positions only deepen suspicion. Another unresolved issue is whether Admiral Bradley, who has been repeatedly named in leaks, was aware of or involved in the second strike on September 2nd. Did he authorize it? Was he following orders from high up the chain, possibly from the Secretary of Defense? Or were decisions made under unclear circumstances at sea? So far, the Pentagon has refused to provide clarity. Meanwhile, reports from Colombia have added international pressure. Colombian officials claim one of the destroyed vessels was theirs and that the individuals killed were not drug traffickers. According to them, these were civilians who happened to be operating a small fishing boat. While the accuracy of this claim is still uncertain, even the possibility that innocent foreign nationals were killed by unilateral U.S. military action raises severe diplomatic and legal consequences. This is why congressional oversight is so crucial. Under the Constitution, engaging in military actions outside of traditional war zones requires explicit authorization, or at least transparent justification. Yet leaders on the intelligence, armed services, and foreign affairs committees say they still have not received the underlying evidence that would justify labeling these individuals as cartel members or national security threats. The administration continues to argue that these operations are necessary to stop drug traffickers before they reach U.S. shores. But critics point out what should be obvious. These small outboard fishing boats have nowhere near the fuel capacity to travel the thousands of miles to the United States. Without extensive refueling stops that are virtually impossible without detection, these vessels pose no immediate threat. The idea that they were moments away from reaching American waters appears implausible. What is more alarming is the allegation that a second strike was ordered after the individuals were already in the water, injured, stranded, and unable to pose a threat of any kind. If true, this would represent a fundamental violation of not only international law but basic human ethics. It would also contradict the image the United States has long projected, a nation that rescues people in distress at sea, not one that launches fatal strikes against them. With every new leak, every unanswered question, and every shift in the official narrative, the controversy grows. The Pentagon's attempts to restrict press access and control information may have been intended to manage the situation, but the result has been the opposite. Instead of confidence, there is distrust. Instead of stability, there is turmoil. And at the center of it all remains one unanswered question: who gave the order? As the controversy intensifies, the Department of Defense's approach to information control has become a story in itself. Historically, journalists covering the Pentagon have relied on a blend of on-the-record briefings and informal background conversations, practices that have been standard for nearly 80 years. These off-record discussions allowed reporters to verify facts, understand context, and hold military leaders accountable. But that changed almost overnight. In the wake of the September 2nd strike, the Pentagon implemented new restrictions. Any journalist entering the press briefing room had to agree not to report unauthorized information or gather sources within the building. Effectively, they were being asked to surrender the most essential investigative tool in journalism, the ability to talk with informed insiders without fear of government retaliation. Reporters immediately recognized the implications. These restrictions would not just limit leaks. They would prevent the public from learning the truth during moments of crisis. They would also discourage whistleblowers from sharing information about potential wrongdoing. Given the timing, many saw the policy shift as a reaction to whatever had occurred on September 2nd. But in spite of these efforts, the most damaging information, the existence of a second strike on survivors, still surfaced. This contradiction has fueled a new narrative. The truth wants to come out, even if officials attempt to bury it. That narrative gained more traction when Representative Jim Himes emerged from a secure viewing room visibly disturbed. His statement was simple but powerful. The video of the second strike was the most troubling thing he had ever witnessed in public service. He offered no exaggeration, no political flourish, just a stark reflection of what he saw. So what was in that footage? According to multiple sources, the video showed individuals whose vessel had already been destroyed. Some appeared injured, or were unarmed. They were floating in open water, unable to reach safety. And then the second strike hit. For a country that prides itself on humanitarian action at sea, the implications are devastating. The United States Navy has rescued stranded fishermen, disaster survivors, refugees, and even adversaries for decades. Many Americans believe this is part of who the nation is, a moral duty that transcends politics. To see the military use its power not for rescue but for lethal force against defenseless people in the water challenges an image at its core. This is why calls for the full video's release are growing. Lawmakers argue that since the administration already released a carefully edited footage of the first strike, they can no longer claim national security concerns as a reason to withhold arrest. If anything, selective release makes the need for transparency even greater. The public has a right to see the entire incident, not just a version that supports the government's narrative. Meanwhile, legal scholars are raising another concern: due process. For decades, drug traffickers, even violent ones, have been treated as criminals, not wartime combatants. They are prosecuted in courts, not targeted in overseas military operations. The idea of labeling individuals as terrorists simply to justify military action, without evidence or judicial oversight, sets a precedent that alarmed both conservatives and liberals who care about constitutional boundaries. And then there is the international dimension. Foreign governments, including Colombia and Venezuela, are demanding explanations about their citizens who were killed in these operations. If these airstrikes were carried out without verification or authorization, they could constitute violations of sovereignty. Such actions, if mishandled, have the potential to spark diplomatic crises or destabilize alliances. The truth is that the United States may already be sliding into a shadow conflict in the Pacific, one that Congress never proved and the public never debated. And at the heart of that conflict lies a single question: what did the administration know, and when did they know it? The deeper lawmakers dig, the clearer it becomes that this crisis is no longer just about a single strike or even a series of maritime operations. It is about the broader erosion of oversight, an erosion that strikes at the foundation of how military power is supposed to function in a constitutional democracy. Members of Congress from both parties have begun asking the same question: at what point did the executive branch decide it could conduct a military campaign without involving the legislative branch? For years, the United States has drawn a clear line between criminal enforcement and acts of war. Drug traffickers, no matter how dangerous, were prosecuted through law enforcement agencies. They were arrested, extradited, and tried in court. They were not treated as combatants in a foreign war. That system, based on due process and international norms, has long been supported by both conservative and liberal legal scholars. But critics now argue that this line has been quietly erased. By labeling maritime suspects as terrorists or combatants, the administration may have effectively granted itself wartime powers that allow strikes without congressional approval. Yet when pressed, officials still insist the United States is not at war. The contradiction is glaring. If the country is not at war, how can wartime authorities be invoked to justify lethal operations thousands of miles from American shores? Several lawmakers have pointed out another troubling detail. The vessels targeted so far have been small, slow, and incapable of reaching the United States without multiple refueling stops. These are not high-speed trafficking submarines or heavily armed cartel ships. They are basic outboard boats, fishing vessels in many cases. The claim that they pose an imminent threat appears increasingly difficult to defend. More alarming still is the allegation that some of the individuals killed were not traffickers at all. Officials in Colombia assert that 2 or 3 of the victims were Colombian nationals with no connection to drug cartels. If true, then innocent civilians were struck by U.S. firepower without warning, evidence, or diplomatic consultation. Yet despite the seriousness of these concerns, several lawmakers say they have not been given access to the underlying intelligence. They have not seen proof of cartel affiliation. They have not been briefed on the rules of engagement. They have not been told who authorized the second strike in the September 2nd incident. Instead, briefings have been given selectively, primarily to those who already support the administration or who are willing to accept the official explanations without question. This selective transparency is now generating bipartisan frustration. Even Republican members who usually support aggressive security policies are calling for review, saying they cannot defend what they cannot see. Legal analysts warn that if the executive branch bypasses Congress in this way, it sets a dangerous precedent for future presidents. Without oversight, a commander-in-chief could effectively start a shadow conflict anywhere in the world by labeling groups as threats and using military force against them. Such actions could escalate without public debate, without accountability, and without the checks and balances that define the American system. This is why the footage of the second strike is so critical. It is no longer just evidence of a single operation. It is a symbol of the larger struggle over truth, legality, and power. Representative Himes described the video as the worst thing he had seen in public service. If that assessment is accurate, the American public may have a right to see it as well. At the moment, however, the administration appears determined to prevent its release. That refusal only intensifies suspicion. Every day the footage remains unseen, the crisis deepens and the questions grow louder. And those questions are no longer simply about what happened at sea. They are about what kind of government the United States is becoming. As the controversy accelerates, one thing has become unmistakably clear. This is no longer a quiet policy disagreement or an isolated military misstep. It is a political crisis, one with the potential to reshape the balance of power in Washington and alter the course of the presidency itself. For many observers, the moment Representative Jim Himes emerged from the secure viewing room and described the second strike video as the worst thing he had seen in public service marked a turning point. His statement carried an unusual weight. Himes is not known for exaggeration or grandstanding. His sober assessment immediately amplified the urgency of the situation. It signaled that this was not simply a matter of disagreement over policy, but a matter of moral gravity. At the same time, the administration's public messaging has struggled. Early on, officials promoted the first strike video as a demonstration of strength, a clean, decisive operation against what they labeled cartel operatives. But now that same video has become evidence of selective disclosure. Observers argue that it was released precisely because it showed the administration in the most favorable light, while concealing the far more troubling footage of the second strike. The calls for transparency have now grown into demands. Lawmakers insist they must see all communications related to the September 2nd operation, including orders, intelligence assessments, and internal discussions. They want to know who authorized the second strike, who was present, and whether there were objections raised along the chain of command. Even some Republicans, traditionally aligned with the administration, have begun echoing these demands. Meanwhile, the political environment is shifting rapidly. Polls indicate that the president's approval rating has dropped sharply in the days since the story broke. Public trust in the administration's handling of national security is weakening. Critics argue that the pattern, restrict information, defend actions, attack the press, then shift explanations, resembles attempt to control a narrative rather than reveal the truth. Civil rights advocates and constitutional scholars warn that if the incident is not fully investigated, it could normalize the use of military force without oversight. They argue that the Constitution gives Congress, not the President, the power to declare war, and that bypassing this process erodes democratic foundations. Legal experts point to past crises where overreach or secrecy led to long-term damage, reminding the public that unchecked power rarely remains contained. Internationally, the situation is becoming equally delicate. If Colombian nationals were indeed killed, diplomatic fallout could escalate. Foreign governments may demand explanations, reparations, or even formal inquiries. The U.S. risks being viewed as a nation willing to conduct unilateral lethal operations without verification, transparency, or accountability. That perception could complicate alliances and undermine geopolitical stability. And yet the most haunting part of this unfolding crisis is not political. It is human. According to those who viewed the full video, the individuals in the water were stranded, injured, and incapable of posing a threat. They were floating in open ocean, defenseless. The idea that a nation which once prided itself on humanitarian rescue could instead deliver another strike on vulnerable people has shaken even seasoned officials. This disconnect between America's ideals and the actions alleged in this case is what troubles lawmakers most. They fear that such conduct, if left unaddressed, changes the country itself. It shifts the moral compass. It redefines what military power can be used for. As the story continues to evolve, with new leaks, new statements, and new revelations, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. The truth will have consequences. Whether those consequences lead to reform, accountability, or political fallout remains to be seen. But for now, one central theme defines this crisis, a fight not only for answers, but for the very principles that define American governance.